Kendall Hemphill writes an outdoor column for my home newspaper and for several other newspapers in the state. And recently he wrote about that voice in your head. You know that little voice that says, don't stand up on the tailgate of the pickup while the pickup is going 70 miles an hour down the highway. It's that voice that tells you not to lean way, way, way over the edge of a very tall building. It's that voice that tells you not to walk up to a group of Harleys in a parking lot and sit down on one and think, I'm going to pretend I'm riding and make that vroom, vroom noise. That voice. That's the voice. It's the voice that tells you, you know what? Something really bad could happen here. And that voice has a name, and the name of it is fear. The article went on to talk about a guy who doesn't have much fear. He's a guy named Alex, and he is the world's best rock climber. His oh no indicator in the brain is defective. It's not working. And I mean, it really is not working. They did an MRI of his brain, and it showed that his amygdala, that part of the brain that warns you about really scary stuff, his amygdala is different than yours and mine. So he has no fear. Somebody can say to Alex, Alex, don't do that. It's going to kill you. And it doesn't faze him. He does it anyway. Which is why Alex does free solo climbing. He will go up 2,000 foot cliffs, and he will do it without a rope, without a harness, and without a net below. Free solo climbing is to regular rock climbing like skydiving is to getting out of bed in the morning. In other words, there's no comparison with those things. So no fear is not just a brand of clothing, but it is the way that Alex lives. And it's why he is the greatest rock climber in the world. Do you have fears? And what are your fears? You know, I ask that because it's easier to deal with your fears when you know exactly what you're afraid of. It's a whole lot easier to get the monster out from under your bed and get rid of it if you know what the monster is. So the power of fear can decrease when you name your fears. I remember things that scared me as a kid, like what will happen to me if my parents die? Or at night, will a spider crawl in my mouth while I sleep and am snoring? It won't. I read it won't, okay? I'm trusting it won't. But, you know, I've grown up now, but there are still things that scare me. They may be different than those things when I was a little boy, but there are still things that scare me. And I suspect we all have things that scare us, things that we're afraid of. We have those things, and we know that sometimes our fears can blind us and bind us. And today as we read this passage from Mark, Jesus, I think one of the things he's saying to us is that Jesus wants to come and unbind us and unblind us. In other words, he wants to set us free from fears that bind us up, and he wants to help us see more clearly. He speaks today about the end of the great temple, the one in Jerusalem. It is not the end of the world. We'll hear about that on the first Sunday in Advent, coming fairly soon. But he speaks of the end of the temple and the destruction of Jerusalem. Here's the background. Jesus and the disciples had been inside the temple, and Jesus notices someone who is unnoticeable, someone always overlooked. a small poor widow who puts small coins into the offering plate. And Jesus points out, look, no one else ever sees her, but he says, look at this woman. She has given everything that she has. We read about that last week. She gave everything that she has. And we know, of course, Jesus soon will give everything he has on the cross. Very soon. And now, today, that has just happened. And so they go outside the temple. They walk outside the temple door and they look up and their eyes are so wide. You have to know that the disciples were from nowhere important. Nazareth, can anything good come from there? They're from Galilee. They're from Mason, Cat Spring, Odom, that's where Pastor Hal grew up, Doss, Stonewall. These are small town people, and they've come to the big city of Jerusalem. It's kind of like me when I go to Dallas or to Houston, country gone to town. And they look up at the temple. It is Jerusalem's main attraction. Nobody may notice the widow, but everybody notices the temple. Everyone. You can see it so well. And they say, wow. Or maybe like Gomer Pyle. Some of you remember the old Andy Griffith show. Gomer Pyle. Golly, Shazam. Look at these big stones. Look at this magnificent building. They are stunned. And the temple was stunning. Josephus, the Jewish historian, said that it was covered on all sides with massive plates of gold. In fact, when the sun hit it at a certain angle, it is said no one could look at it because it would blind you. It was so bright. And he said that when you approached Jerusalem, as you were coming up toward Mount Zion, as you were heading up toward Jerusalem, it looked like a snow-covered mountain, brightly shining. Everything not covered in gold was bright white stone. And the stones, you can still see some of them today if you go to Israel, to Jerusalem. Some of the stones were 40 feet long, 12 feet high, 18 feet wide. It was believed to be the one place on earth where God would meet people, where heaven would meet earth. It was one of the wonders of the world. And the disciples say, wow. It's hard to tell if they are awestruck like tourists at the sheer beauty and majesty of the temple, or whether they're thinking like disciples and thinking, wow, this is what we're up against. This building of King Herod, who allowed it to appease the Jews, but also to show his power. And the Herodians now and the religious elite, this is what we are up against. Jesus is not impressed. He's been there before to the temple. He held a seminar when he was only 12 years old at the temple. And so Jesus says the temple's just a heap of rocks. He said, yes, these buildings are beautiful and the stones are massive. But here's a secret. The day is coming when not a stone will be left untouched. This place is going down. This place is going down. And that sounds scary. You think of things that happen. You think of the airplane crash yesterday afternoon here in Fredericksburg. Who would thought something would fall out of the sky? It can trigger your amygdala in your brain to think of fearful things happening. It can be fearful to realize that what is intentionally built, like the temple, or like churches very often, to look big and heavy and eternal and a center of life, and to think how they can come tumbling down. Emil Brunner once said, sometimes God shakes everything so that we can see what will really stand forever, what is really eternal. God shakes everything, and that is scary. But Jesus speaks hope into our fears. Jesus says this is not the end. These are are birth pains. These are birth pains. Birth pains hurt, so I'm told. So I could tell when my kids were delivered on my wife's face, these birth pains hurt and they are intense. But you know, after they are over, there's a baby. There is joy. And so God is giving birth to something that is new for you and for the world. But it doesn't always feel like joy. Jesus tells us then how to live when the walls come tumbling down. He says two things. He wants to help the disciples learn how to see more clearly and how not to be bound by fear. He says, one, watch out, and two, be afraid. Be not afraid. First, he says, watch out for doomsday people who say, it's the end, it's the end. They will deceive you. And secondly, do not be afraid when you hear of wars and rumors of wars. Keep your head. Don't panic. This is routine history. Happens over and over. It's not a sign of the end. Nation's going to fight nation. Kingdom's going to fight kingdoms. There are going to be earthquakes. There are going to be famines. Always have been. Always will be. Do not be alarmed. These are the beginning of birth pains. They are signs of hope. This past Lent, we used hope as the theme for our evening worship services. Hope, we said, is better than courage. It takes more than courage to get you beyond fear, to get you into some kind of future. It takes hope. And hope means, as this passage tells us so well, hope means that while a building may be destroyed, the place where God dwells, is never destroyed. The place that God dwells, that was built in 3 days, is the resurrected Jesus Christ. And Jesus keeps coming in word and in sacrament and the outreach that we do in our community and in our world. Jesus keeps coming. You know, there is always a part of the world that is passing away. I was surprised this last week when the CEO of Amazon at the top of the world right now, the CEO of Amazon said, Amazon is not too big to fail. He was telling his employees, don't get complacent. But he said one day, Amazon will fail. It will go bankrupt. And something new will arise. Kind of a timely word. We just heard that Sears filed bankruptcy. Those of you who have lived long enough remember a Sears catalog coming at Christmas time. It was the most wonderful thing. We never would have guessed it would be gone in the moment, in a twinkling of an eye. One day, the walls of Bethany are going to come tumbling down. I hope it'll be at least 300 or 400 years. But I assure you, the walls of this place will come tumbling down. But the place of God, the place where God dwells, is not in a temple that is made by hands. The place where God dwells is in the resurrected Jesus Christ. And Jesus will always show us a way of life. I can't find in the Bible where Jesus tries showing us a way to fear the end of life or to be afraid of the end of life. He is always showing us a way of life, whether it is now or whether it is in eternity. Sometimes when everything is falling apart or falling down, sometimes it turns out that for the first time, things are really coming together again. We don't see it right away, but coming together. Michael Marsh is a writer, and he says he remembers the morning of his divorce. He remembers the afternoon his youngest son called and said, "Dad, I'm going to join the Marines." And he remembers the night that his oldest son died. And Michael writes, with each of those events, One of the great buildings of my life was thrown down. Stones that I had so carefully placed and upon which I had built my life no longer stood one upon another. The temples of my world, he said, had fallen. My world changed and my life would be different. And he goes on to write how we all build our temples, and some of them will come crashing down. Jesus reminds us that in the midst of all the rubble, God is standing there and God is ready to help us rebuild. Because of all things we can say about God, one thing we know, God is a builder. The end is really a new beginning. And the beginning only points us to a glorious end, which is the victory of Jesus Christ, our Savior, who will turn this world around, and who even now in our own time is using you and using us and using the church to turn the world around. So the blind will see, the bound are free, and at last, no fear. Amen.
We hope you have been blessed by this presentation from Bethany Lutheran Church in Fredericksburg. We invite you to worship with us on Sunday mornings at 8, 10:25, or 10:30 a.m. Please like, share, and subscribe this video so that you can help spread the good news of Jesus Christ.